I think I know people will trickle in, but I think we're probably pretty good to start. Yeah, Michael?
Yeah, that's great. Let's get going. We got a lot to cover.
Awesome. Okay. I'm looking at all these comments of where everybody is.
So I'll start by introducing myself. So I'm Michael Hoffman. I'm the co-founder, CEO at Gather Voices. We're a software company that helps associations lift up the voices of members, which we're going to talk a little bit about. I've been working with association leaders on member engagement strategies for a long time. When I have the time, which has not been recently, I teach marketing at the University of Chicago, and I speak a lot around engagement strategies and video in particular. And I'm glad to be here.
And as am I. I'm Brianne Wheeler. I lead the marketing team at PropFuel, which, if you're not familiar, is a conversational engagement platform on email and SMS for built especially for associations. And I always like to say this: while I currently work in software, most of my experience is as an association marketing leader, marketing communications. So I worked for an AMC for a long time with several national healthcare association clients, and then also did non-dues marketing for a little bit at Texas Medical Association in Austin. So I speak regularly on webinars like this one. I had a session at ASAE Annual last year. Honestly, it's one of my favorite things to do, is to connect with people. So I'm very happy to be here today as well.
Awesome.
Oops, sorry about that. It skipped ahead to us.
Oh, everybody got a very quick preview.
Yeah.
Slides.
There we go. So what we're going to be talking about today, first we're going to kind of cover what I'm calling the loudest voices in the room, just covering a little bit of psychology, sociology, I guess you'd say, and also the concept of pattern interrupt. And then we'll talk a little bit about engagement through the member lifecycle and engaging and finding the voice of the member through the member lifecycle. And then some more specific tactics to try when you're trying something new, like video or asking questions, to gather and share your member voices.
So I would just, as a kind of level setting and getting started, really, when we talk about voice of member, one of the things that we know is that people would much rather hear from their peers than brands. We're in a world where top-down communication has eroded trust, and bottom-up communication is what's really resonating with people. And if you think about how people spend their time on TikTok or Instagram or other things, you think about people who, what institutions people don't trust anymore. People really want to hear from people. So that's, I think, something that will color the entire presentation and discussion we're having today, and that you should be thinking about. There's a lot of research about this out there that, that shows that the messenger matters, and that, that has a lot to do with member engagement and voice of member as we get into it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So what is the voice of the member? Tell us what you think. Put something in the chat. Brianne, what is the voice of the member?
I was thinking about this within the context of the association space, and I think that it is, one sentence is hard for me in general, but I think that the voice of the member is really about the member's opportunity to have input at any point in the member life cycle. So that could be related to their membership in any capacity when they just join, or why they didn't join, or also anything in between, anything related to events, education, just that real opportunity to have an input at any point.
Yeah, I like that. I think one thing we can't forget in the association world is that we're really uniquely situated, where the voice of the member is where everything originates from, right? The intelligence about the industry or profession comes from the members. That's where it all comes from. And so you think about a brand like a clothing brand or whatever that's just making up stories that doesn't have that connection. It's like such a powerful thing that we have, which is the lived experience of all these members. And again, that's what goes into practice guidelines, and that's what goes into all the things associations do, really. So to me, the voice of the member is the core of what an association is all about.
Yeah, absolutely. We have some great comments here, so I'll read a few of them. Voice of the member, Dave, you said when a member says something to in free form, okay, so like less about the in a less structured way. Driving force of our mission, Michael, that's what you were saying. What do they want? What do they need? And what do they want from us? Yes. So member focused, right? As opposed to association focused. The interaction between the member and association, that's certainly true. I like to think about that as we were mentioning a few minutes ago on the person-to-person level rather than like member to association level. That's always typically one-to-one or has the opportunity to be. When they can express their needs or thoughts in a free space, opportunity to provide input or be involved in decision-making. I love that. I'm going to cover that a little bit later. That decision-making piece is huge. Their input on how we're doing, absolutely. Input on the direction of the association, yes. How can we help you? The voice member is the hope of the impact they want to achieve through the community. So yeah, that's great. When they can share feedback and suggestions to their wants and needs. Two-way conversation, great, awesome. And then good or bad, it's how an organization should prioritize its goals. Vanessa, I completely agree with that.
Awesome. Really good comments.
Yes. So moving forward, I'm going to talk about, I'm kind of diving into the deep end early on here to talk about some of our just like human circumstances and how we interact and what we need. There are two theories. You might be familiar with the hierarchy of needs from Maslow. That's something that most of us are probably familiar with, but something that's a little bit more that's not talked about as much, which I discovered a few years ago, is called the FIRO theory, fundamental interpersonal relations orientation. And it's a theory that has more to do with how people interact with others and what they need from an interpersonal standpoint. So first, just taking a look at this hierarchy of needs, even with Maslow's hierarchy, I love this graphic because it's different from what we normally see. It shows how over time needs change. Even if we all have the same basic 5 needs, they change over time based on the course of one's life, or maybe it's even one's career in this circumstance. So I had never seen this visualization until about a year ago. And this seems to me to be a better visualization of how we actually, our basic needs happen and how some are priorities other than others at certain points in life.
Well, and the needs don't go away, right? The intensity just changes. Yeah. And sort of what's top of mind changes depending on where you're at.
Exactly. And of course it makes sense, like the physiological needs when you're a child. I love this. I think about it this way now, as opposed to just like the 5 different buckets. So the FIRO theory has to do again with more of our interpersonal needs. And there are these 3 different buckets that he identifies. And one of them is inclusion, the second one is control, and the other one's affection. And so as you can see this, I'd encourage you to look it up if you want to look into it more, but there's a combination that each of us have related to this. And so one might have a high need of inclusion that they want, and then maybe the affection side is not so much. So we all have this combination of the 3, and how that's relevant to associations is when you're talking about members and leaders inside of a membership organization, each of us have different needs. And I have the hunch, I don't have any, data to support this necessarily, but I think that those who have the highest needs of these three, the inclusion, the control, and affection, are the ones who end up leading organizations, making decisions, being the loudest voices in the room, always being the one to respond to the survey, et cetera. And so I think this is important to look at with membership organizations. So individuals, they want to be heard. That's just human nature. They like to talk about themselves. That's just also human nature. Anytime you do, and I'm a particular fan of these, like any type of like strengths or kind of personality test, anything like that, I love, because it's just like a self-study, and people love to talk about those things. I know I do. And then most importantly on this point, when all members can't be heard, or where there's not an opportunity for sharing member voices, there actually ends up being an unintentional bias that happens, because important decisions end up getting made from those loudest voices in the room. And that can show up in a couple different ways. These are just a few: budget approvals. There might be a reason why somebody thinks that you don't need a new software product, for example, but then and it's based on a board of directors opinion about that product or type of product. And so therefore, that software that might have been helpful doesn't get approved. Strategic decisions, maybe certain decisions for hiring. I mean, that could go across the board with strategic priorities. Often the loudest voices in the room have the most input. And then even my favorite example is conference locations. So I used to work with an association that had an annual conference, and they decided that every 3 years they were going to go to Disney. And that had no financial or strategic weight to it. It was really because most of the longtime members on the board of directors loved Disney. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I thought I realized it a couple of years ago and thought, wow, like that decision was very unilateral, and it actually didn't serve the organization in a lot of different ways. It wasn't going to attract the younger people they were trying to get in. I know a lot of people like Disney, but like for this particular case, I just don't think it was the right fit. So all of these decisions get made, and it's just from some people have more weight. And those who have that higher need for like the control and the affection end up being the ones that have the decisions go in their favor. So, and Michael, I know you have some things to say about that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we end up skewing things based on people's opinions, and those opinions aren't necessarily based in any data. And I think that's one way. I've been asked many times in consulting with organizations, how do we who are not at the board level or not at the senior leadership level, how do we influence things? How do we make sure that decisions aren't made that way? And I think, one way is to talk about data and say, well, you don't like that color, but what does the data say? I see that a lot. I've seen that a lot in philanthropy as well. It's like, I don't like this. It's like, well, I don't really care what you don't like. We care what works and what is right for the people that we're communicating with. And so I think the more you can try to represent the things in a data-driven way, the more you can get people out of that mindset of, hey, I like this or I don't like this, right? It's like, let's think criteria and let's figure out what that is. And that has also to do with representation. I was a couple of years ago at a major dental association, where they were lamenting the fact that most of the people at the conference who were speaking were middle-aged white guys. And most of the people on some of the material were middle-aged white guys. And the person I was meeting with said to me, every new dentist is an Asian woman. And if we don't have those people in our materials, if we're not representing them on stage, on the board, in our website, they're just not going to think this is for them. And I think that these things are really related, right? Is being able to say, who who are we, but also who are we trying to attract? Because again, the same thing with younger members. I know that's something that many organizations are really focused on. Well, if I don't see any younger members and I don't see any activity from younger members and I don't see the kinds of programming that younger members would be interested in, I'm not going to think this is for me. And that's so obvious when you state it that way. And inside the organizations making decisions, sometimes it doesn't feel so obvious.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, I think also, I just mentioned a lot of more strategic points when it comes to getting, input and how that impacts the organization, but it can be small things too. It doesn't have to be some, big project or big decision or initiative. It's everyday things that happen in the organization that the member has the opportunity to have an input in.
Yeah. And I think Melissa's comment here about, the people who are more involved forget what it's like to be an average member. I think that's right. And it becomes a kind of bubble. And I think both of us are talking about how do we burst that bubble? How do you not just sit in your board meeting or your room and think that that's what everybody wants? How do you bring in the voice of the member? And that's the core of what we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, we're going to hand it back to you. So what is one time when not seeking member opinions, input, feedback, didn't get you the results that you wanted, or even caused you to make a mistake, whether it be small or large? I know this might take a minute to think about, but I'd love to hear from you if you have something that's kind of, as we've been talking so far, what's coming to mind for you as it relates to your work and organization.
I thought your example of location, for events is a good one. That I think event location is a really complicated decision-making process around cost and availability and time and size and venues and, and things. And there's enough there to have data drive that decision. And it can really go off the rails if it's not done that way.
Yeah. And we actually, at that one year, it was even maybe a worse decision, was to go to Las Vegas. And that's a very expensive conference city. And it was how they came to that was another one of those, like, let's just switch it up. Like, where should we go to on the West Coast? And so there is, to your point about data, there's a lack of data there that's possible, that isn't just random data, like even behavioral. It's literally like you could have just asked everybody where they want to go, and there was just none of that.
I think that's a great point. It's just like, asking is helpful. That doesn't mean you're taking a vote on everything, but it means that you're getting input. And I think Melissa's comment here about designing a new platform and not asking or thinking they knew what people wanted to see on a dashboard and being totally wrong. And sometimes I think you can ask people questions, but sometimes you need to do experiments. So, sometimes people will say one thing and do a different thing. So sometimes the experiments are actually more effective than just asking. And we know one of the challenges that organizations have is survey people feeling kind of, the surveys having to be short and being able to, to send, if you send people really long, complicated surveys, how they will just tune out of that as well. And it's like, how do we get the information? How do we get the member voice and share that?
And I think there's a big timing component here. So like when we think about Michael, and we were talking about this before the webinar today, the timing component is everything doesn't have to be a big project. So when you're talking about getting feedback, it's not like, it doesn't have to be some big initiative. It can be just like in little doses. And there's a timing component to that, because a lot of the time when we do ask, for example, post-conference, we ask, a particular question that may not be relevant for the next year. You've gotten information, but didn't actually do anything with it in a time frame that was helpful or useful.
Right.
So I was
Right.
getting a ton of great comments here on,
Yeah, really, really good comments. I think Meta's comment around dues restructuring getting a lot of pushback. I think sometimes, when you make a change, sometimes there's a smaller group of people who are really unhappy. And again, they could be the squeaky wheel, but not necessarily be representative of the bigger change and the bigger advantage. It's hard to make any significant changes without upsetting some people. And if you try to please everyone all the time, you can also create problems for yourself.
yeah,
And I think
absolutely.
Bonnie's point about asking is nice, but getting that meaningful input, it can be challenging. And so how do you do that? And that, I know you'll talk about that a little bit in
Yeah.
a little bit.
Yeah, and even Melanie, you said, you haven't asked or studied how members want to connect with each other. That kind of motivation may not be there to get people regularly to, say, a social community or wherever it is. That is, I think, a perfect opportunity to just do a lot of little experiments on what might work. Try some little things. I think this is the other thing. It's like sometimes I don't think we experiment enough, and then it's just big bucket. Well, this isn't working, so we should get rid of it. Or this isn't, we're just not going to do this anymore. When really we didn't kind of uncover all the possibilities for that initiative or whatever it was.
Yeah,
I love
Vanessa talking about a member community, I think community is a great example where just calling something a community doesn't make a community, right? It's just saying, oh, here's the thing for the community. And it's like, if nobody's there, it's not really a community. And you can think that that's what people want, and it's not necessarily what they want. And in that vein, I'm sure you've seen this too, where there's not one size fits all. There's associations where their community software is really well used and a lot of discussion, a lot of activity. And there's other industries or professions where it's just really hard. People are not engaging in that same way. And you have to do things that are organic for your organization and not just things that other people are doing.
That's a great point. It just reminded me when I was speaking at ASAE annual last year, I asked the audience to do something similar to this, to raise their hand and share, stories about engaging with members. And one woman stood up and said, literally, like, these members that we have, they want a phone call. Like, they do not have email. They don't just not want email, like they don't even use it. It was a particular industry that was, I can't remember what it was, but it was really interesting to hear her say. It's kind of the opposite of what we talk about all the time in terms of strategy, but she knew that this is what they want, and this is what we have to deliver, and this is how we need to deliver it to them because it's what they're looking for.
And another thing I'll just mention, sorry to interrupt you, it's not all the same across your membership either, right? When you look at there's generational differences around communication. Some people want to text and other people want to go on, get an email. And so, how can you deliver? Some of it's about how do you do big things across your membership, but some of it's also about personalization. How do I give people what they want inside of a framework that's for everybody?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to give one example of this. Another example is this kind of underinformed creation of a corporate membership. So when an association I'm pretty familiar with, they developed this new corporate membership program, and they were really excited about it. It was for larger teams. It was organizational members. And so there's actually a PropFuel client, and they said, we want to go ask members how large their teams are. And this was when the membership had already been developed. They were ready to launch it. So they basically wanted to know who to deliver this to, so that's great, right? You don't want to deliver this to everyone because it may not be relevant to them. But then also the challenge with that and the risk was really that they didn't know from the start how much of their membership wanted this corporate membership option. And so the question that came to mind for me was, what if most of the members had small team sizes? They didn't know the makeup. And so they now had that information and knew who to deliver it to. But if it had been a small group that it was actually relevant for, then that larger strategic part of the corporate membership program as a whole would have been kind of a waste, right? It may not have been such a success. Maybe they still would have done it, but on a smaller scale or whatever, it was. They had spent time developing this and then found out late that it was a thing. So I think the incorporating the voice of the member there would have been really helpful, just to even understand from a, profile perspective, their membership as a whole. Also, so the lack of engagement, I know this is probably not going to be a shock to a lot of association professionals, but the lack of engagement really does cost associations members and revenue. I was looking at the Marketing General benchmarking report and the other day, and the lack of engagement with the organization, and I've seen this in several other reports and benchmarking studies, that sits at the top. And I know that voices, incorporating the voice of the member and better engagement, better, two-way dialogue between the association and its members is absolutely key to that. You could have one touch point where somebody just has a quick email exchange, or it doesn't have to be, in person to make a difference. There are all kinds of touch points throughout the year where members can say, okay, I see the value now. I'm going to stay. This is worth it. And sometimes that shows up in actual member benefits. There might be just sometimes it is transactional. There are some circumstances where it's like, this is what I need. I had that with the American Marketing Association. They had this marketing toolkit, and I really didn't do anything with the organization throughout the year, except I knew I needed that. So sometimes there is some actual member benefit that delivers the value on its own. But I think most of the time that's not the case. And so finding better ways to engage is really essential to the health of the organization.
Yeah. And I love Christy's comment around making phone calls. Sometimes just that, I'm reaching out to somebody and I'm listening is going to make them feel different about the organization and create the opportunity for ongoing engagement that wasn't there before. And so thinking about, how do we bring people in and how do we get them to feel like they're part of it?
Yeah, absolutely. And also, Christy, knowing who to call is great too. And I have some examples of this, but sometimes it's overwhelming to say, okay, well, I know I can't call every member. I had an association executive come up to me at Non-Duzapalooza, which, by the way, we're going next week. We'll be in Denver with Terry Carden and crew. But a couple of years ago, one of the EDs of an organization said, it's COVID and we're getting over a tough year, and I'm just going to call every single member that's just on my list. And I don't know how many members they had, but it seemed daunting to me. And I think that's what we do a lot of the time. So finding out who needs the attention is also important, which knowing your members better is going to help with knowing who may need the attention at any given point.
And just one other quick point on that is the onboarding piece is important too. It's like you have this moment when somebody first joins or somebody renews, and you have a moment to reach out to them, and you can create that more as a cadence than just saying we got to talk to everybody all the time. And how somebody comes in those first few weeks and months and first few communications is going to have a lot to do with how they feel about the organization emotionally and how much they lean in versus, wonder if this was a good decision. Yeah.
Yeah. And Dante, you said being proactive is key. And that's, Michael, what I think you're speaking to is sometimes we do communicate based on transactions, right? So communication is more frequent maybe after, or maybe even the acquisition process. We're sending a lot of join, messaging. And then after we kind of quote, get what we want, it may drop off. And then the same thing happens, okay, they're about to lapse, or the conference is getting closer, or we just we just launched this educational product and we need to meet the goal because we spent a bunch of money developing this product. It's sometimes, I've never actually thought about this before now, but it's actually, we communicate a lot based on that transactional nature. And I don't mean to say that in a negative light. It's just the reality of like looking at numbers and saying we need to do something. And, you know, to your point about how, you know, Michael, how they're going to feel about the organization, all of these elements right here have to do more with the qualitative versus the quantitative nature of the relationship, which is about listening, you know, understanding intent, understanding needs, resolving problems. Some problems are so simple, like, you know, one organization just had an option in one of their campaigns about, you know, their invoice and renewing their membership. And one of the responses was, I'm trying to think of the wording of it. It was something like, I want to rejoin, but my invoice is wrong. So like, how many times have I've done this before where something comes into your email, like, well, that's not quite right. Or like, that's not what I want to repurchase. So I'm just going to leave it for later. So that's all just like resolving really easy problems that don't need to be complicated, that mean money at the end of the day, dollars, you know? But also the creating connection, building trust, offering guidance, that's especially important during onboarding. So there's this whole opportunity aside from just this transactional nature of like delivering information and hoping that a member is going to respond to it and interact. There's a whole range of reasons to listen in this way.
Yeah, Dave points out, you know, the idea of triggers, of being able to know when that cadence is based on the activities that people have. I think that's really good. And Madeline also saying about how engagement builds relationships and referrals and sets the tone is absolutely right. And Dorothy, having one-to-one meetings with every new member and inviting board members and stuff to do that, that's amazing. Like, that is so great. And I think, you know, if you look at how often do you get new members, what's the case? I think more organizations than you think would be able to do that. It's not that, you know, you usually don't get 10,000 members joining in the same week. So I think, you know, I think a lot more organizations could probably manage that than are doing that today.
Yeah, it's a trickle, you know, for renewals. So that's a really good point.
Yeah, and retention, I think, just points that out too. 6 to 8 per month, like that's probably fairly typical and totally doable. Love that. Nice going.
Yeah, absolutely. So this, I just wanted to mention, I can send this later in an email if you want to look more closely at it, but this is our member engagement life cycle. And one of the things we found is that like associations really have it's sometimes overwhelming to think about like when to interact and how to engage, and just it can just be overwhelming from all the things we've been talking about today, really. So this just really lays out the 4 categories in the way we think about the cycle of engagement, and it starts with the awareness and recruitment. Then you have the ongoing engagement once they're a member or engaged in any meaningful way. Then you have the renewal process and the reinstatement if they've lapsed. And so this just keeps going. And going back to that point about the transactional nature, this is just an ongoing thing. I think we think about it in certain points of the year, but there are so many opportunities to connect throughout the year, even if it's just simple profile, you know, getting new profile data. I have a couple examples of that. That's you know, it's simple, but it's just a small point of engagement that's like, oh, they're paying attention, or they're curious about this about me. Those little things can make a big difference.
Absolutely.
And then just I wanted to show you the way that we think about this at PropFuel is a process called ask, capture, and act. So we start, rather than starting with what we need to tell the membership, the philosophy is like, why don't you first find out more information? Now you have a new piece of information, and then you can act on it both in the moment, which is something that the surveys we were talking about, the long form or large benchmarking studies, that's where you can't act immediately, right? And then you also have this new piece of information that you didn't have before, which can inform all of the things we've been talking about today, from just basic profile information to wants and needs and resolving problems and all of that. And yes, Christy, I will share this presentation. Absolutely.
And it's so common where it's like, what do we need? We need people to come to our event. We need this. We need people to do this. We need members to whatever new, and if you can turn that inside out, is what you're doing here, is saying, what do they need? And how does that change how we respond? That's really powerful.
It's really a different way of just approaching communications as a whole. It's also tactical, but it's really like a mindset to get your head around, where instead of just sending out the 6 to 8 membership renewal emails, like what could we do differently to find out more, instead of just sending out these things. And honestly, that was one of the most frustrating parts of my, just backing up here, I'm sorry, I skipped forward. That was one of the most frustrating parts about being an association marketer, was the not knowing what else to do. It's like, you're like, I'm doing all of these things. I sent the reminder. We had this campaign and we've measured it and it didn't work. And now what? And that's the hard part. And so I think it's nice to think about it in a way that's like, well, maybe we can discover something new, and maybe there's a new, approach to doing it that'll get us better success. So on that note, so simply asking to increase win back. So this is American Association of Nurse Practitioners. They are doing such amazing work right now. They sent out this simple campaign, and this normally would be stacked. This is an email campaign, but it's so simple. It's not a block of text like, here are all the member benefits you get, and if you join today, you'll get a discount to the conference, or you'll get entered into a sweepstakes, which they did one of those too, but they did that a while back, and now they switched it to be much more simple. And this is just so simple. Like, do you want to save 15%? Yes or no, or maybe tell me more. And what that does for the member is, first, it gives them an opportunity to respond. And if they say no, thank you, then you can leave them alone, which is part of the struggle we talk about all the time with too many member communications. Well, if they're not interested, then just leave them alone about it for a while, right? If it's tell me more, you can find out more. And then yes, of course, you can call them to action to rejoin and get their savings. So ANP, this is no joke. They sent this campaign out to their entire list. In one day, they had 432 new members, and it was a ton of dues revenue for them. And this campaign is still open, actually, so I don't have the final numbers, but they have been over the moon about it because it was just so simple. It's nothing complex. It's just, let's find out more. Let's, take people who want to go down this path where they want to go.
Yeah, and I'd just point out, there was a question about that, around discounting. It doesn't have to be discounting, right? You can have that exact same framework and say, do you want the t-shirt? Or, it could be, hey, did you know that 50 other people just recently joined? Would you like to learn some more about why they did that? Like, it doesn't have to be the discount. It's really about less text, more interaction, getting them to be active.
That's right. Yeah. And Bonnie, I don't know, I didn't look at that particular campaign, but tell me more, I'm sure, was an informational page about, more, just telling them more about membership. They had an opportunity to display a landing page there. The other thing you can do in a case like this, depending on the volume, is send an internal alert to, speaking of knowing who to call and knowing who to talk to. This is a good way to identify who needs to be called about talking about membership. I mean, what a gift to the membership team, especially if they do outbound calls about membership, to say, instead of just calling and saying, hey, do you want to join, saying, you said you were interested, let me tell you about it. Like, it's more of a conversation. It's more of like a, let me help you with what you said you wanted, as opposed to, I'm calling because I'm dialing for dollars.
Yeah, and that goes to just the basic customer service, right? The idea of really being responsive to people. It reminds me of my experience with Chewy. I have a dog, and use Chewy for stuff, and just incredible customer service, right? Conversational, like, how can we help you? How do we fix this? And how do you bring some of that culture into your organization to work with your members? It's really powerful.
Absolutely. I just have a few more quick examples. So this one is TIA wanted to find out more about just who their members were from just a company structure. And I could see that helping in a lot of ways. I'm not sure what they end up doing with it, but it's helpful to know what category your members are in so that you can deliver them products and services that really matter. And then this last one is, I think, speaks good to the crux of, I think this is my favorite example, is it speaks to everything we're talking about today about listening. And yes, sometimes it has a goal. Sometimes you want to increase your renewals, or you want to get lapsed members back, or you want to meet your conference goals. But sometimes you can just listen, just to listen. And so one of our clients had a question that they sent out that said, have you ever experienced a Title IX violation? And the responses they got in large paragraphs, it was just open form, were amazing. And there was no end goal in that. I mean, I think they might ask for permission to use some of them, whether it's in advocacy efforts or, whatever it may be. But this was really just to find out more about their members and how many of them had been affected by a violation like this. So really powerful, not related to making money always. And so, yeah, I wanted to put this in here for the marketing and membership people. I don't recall ever getting IT's attention on a campaign that I did. And one of ANP's IT developers sent this the other day and said, I regularly monitor these orders. We got 432, including 66 in 1 hour. We had 95 in an hour. And the single biggest number of orders I've seen typically is 20 to 25. So it's just that asking the question and getting that voice of the member is such a different approach that really you can see results. Michael, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, sure. And we'll just go through a few of these things, but lifting up the voices of members is really what we should build our communication and storytelling about. It's not just, as we started at the beginning of this, saying people want to hear from their peers more than they want to hear from the organization. And so how do you model the behavior you want from others? By lifting up the stories of members. And how do you deliver the news you want to deliver with member stories as well? So love for you to think about that in the chat. If you want to share anything about how do you connect member stories to your objectives, and who's the audience for that? Who are the right people to tell those stories? So think about a particular objective that you have, or a particular goal, and think about who would be the good messengers for those stories, and who are the right people to tell them, and where would we put them? Those are kind of the three big things that we think about. And when we lift up members' voices, is whose voice, who are we targeting, and where do we then share that material out?
Yeah, and I think the more traditional route is to say, oh, we're going to do a message from the executive director or a member of the board of directors. But based on what we were talking about earlier, this is such a good opportunity to just get your quote average member to tell a story that nobody.
Yeah, and it's going to have more influence. I think about your campaign with a discount. Another thing could have been saying, do you want to hear so-and-so just joined? Do you want to hear why? And here's a video of them talking about it. And so the idea of having people like you modeling that behavior that you want is really powerful.
Yeah. Let's see here. Janelle said we wanted to showcase type 2 diabetes reversal. One of our members shared her experience as an endocrinologist. That story was one of our highest shared on social media and spoke to what we were trying to promote from a member's voice.
Yeah, that's a great example, right? Of, you couldn't make that up. You wouldn't even know that it happened. And without asking, you have no idea. Okay, let's go to the next slide.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm gonna go ahead. We have a question in the chat, but I'll address it after.
I think I answered the question around discounts a little bit.
Oh, okay. All right,
Just
great.
that it doesn't have to be a discount. And, I think that's very unique to the individual organization at the moment and what they're offering elsewhere and all of that. But I think the wrong lesson to take from your example was that it's all about a discount. It's really about the mechanism of communicating. So at Gather Voices, we focus on video because we know video creates engagement, and video is the best way to make somebody real, to hear somebody's real voice and real story is extremely powerful. And even more so today in a world where you can have Chat GPT write anything, and we have this flood of mediocre AI produced content coming online. The idea of real people and their voices is going to cut through the noise in a much more important way. And so using, when you want to showcase those voice a member, use the channels that you already have. So whether that's your emails, your social platforms, are people searching? So really understanding where are you doing that. And we see that video content really improves the health of those channels. So 3 times click-through rates on videos where there's a thumbnail, because people would rather click on that video than they would on some giant block of text that they're not going to pay attention to. People will spend more time on a web page with video. People will view more web pages with video. So there's lots of data around this that video will really help your channels. So thinking about how do you use video to lift up the voice of members, and again, make those real. We can go.
It's a great way to use to create new content too. Some of the, struggle today is having the resources to create new content. What better way than to have your member contribute it, whether it be a webinar or a video or whatever it is. That's created directly by the member, which is great.
That's exactly right. I'm glad that you mentioned that, especially with video, because video is the traditional way of video production is slow and expensive and giant projects and really crazy. And the idea of co-creation is what I talk about a lot. Co-creating content with your members. That's where you get so much leverage, because it's less expensive to co-create content than to create it all yourself, but also your members are going to share experiences that you have no idea about, that you couldn't possibly know about, that are going to be really powerful.
Yep, absolutely.
And so, I mentioned this, we don't have to spend too much time on this slide, just there's things that you want to do on your different channels, and video can really be effective to do that. So whether that's increasing conversion rates or engagement rates or click-through rates, those kinds of things. We know that not only does video have an impact on those, but that video from real people, more user-generated video, that co-creation is going to even have more power and more trust than the sort of brand-created content. Oops. So just, quickly, I will just talk a little about this idea of co-created content at scale. And I think, again, this is a real paradigm shift, particularly around the idea of co-creation, the idea of storytelling, and what to do with video. Traditionally, video has always been about video projects. And I have been guilty of this myself, earlier in my career, where you'd spend a lot of money and a lot of effort telling a story that you think is important, and then nobody pays attention to it. And you're like, oh my God, we did all that work. We spent all that money, and like nobody that we care about is actually watching this thing. And so the paradigm today is a lot more content, a lot lower production value with a lot more real people. And that's what we see. And I don't just take it from me, take it from TikTok and Instagram and everything that's really demanding and keeping the attention of people out in the world. People want to see authentic stories from real people, and they care much more about that authenticity than they care about production values. And that works to your advantage because you can do a lot more for a lot less. And so it's really about, we think of these three buckets: gather, how do you get content in? Build, how do you take that content and turn it into things that are shareable? And then sharing them out, how do you put those in your channels that I talked about a little bit ago? So gathering is really about gathering video anytime and anywhere. And the idea is to be able to, again, change the paradigm. Typically, the way that we do video is we say, we want video, let's go chase these people for video content. And it becomes this whole other project. And instead of that, what we see really working is when people are already engaged, how do we ask them to share their story? So if they're registering for an event, we can say, tell us why you're excited to come to the event. If they're renewing their membership, we can say, tell us the main things you're most excited about with your new membership, right? Asking them in the moment is really powerful because they're already engaged, they're already thinking. And then you're collecting content all year long. And you go, oh, well, some of this is good and some of this is mediocre and a little bit of this is bad in terms of maybe not being useful. But that's really powerful to have all this content you can use and deploy all year round. Your events are really powerful places to collect content as well. So clients of ours like ASAE will collect dozens and dozens of videos at their conference to use all year round. The idea is everybody's in one place. Why aren't we asking them questions? Why aren't we thinking about what's on our content calendar 3 months from now? We want to do something around, this issue. Well, let's ask people about it while we have them, and then we can use that content later. There's a question here from Dante. Is there a difference in results from using video for different audiences? Researchers and scientists. Yeah, I think you have to do some experiments to really understand, what works. I think one of the things we've seen is that researchers and scientists often have a hard time making short videos, but they really like to watch short videos. So, that's interesting. And so one of the things we've done is use video for previews of poster sessions or for people to annotate something or ask questions. But I think you really need to experiment with it and not make assumptions about either a generation or a type of thing without giving it a try.
Yeah, so I've worked with a lot of healthcare associations, and for a very long time, some of the associations I worked with were very hesitant to use social media because of HIPAA. So like in their day job, they were very sensitive to information sharing, but the nature of that in an association is different as it relates to the membership. And so, yes, you might not be able, for example, to share the names of the patient in this story that you're talking about. However, you may still be able to share the story. So I think that's a question of a cultural shift when it comes to both the staff of the organization and then starting to get members to think a little bit differently about what's possible in terms of their interactions and sharing.
Yeah, and I think a big piece is permission. HIPAA is all about, for example, protecting people's healthcare data, but that doesn't mean you can't ask somebody to tell their story in it publicly. And if you're saying to someone, I want you to publicly tell your story, they can tell their story. You're not preventing them. So you can balance these things, we should say. So, one of the things is these short form videos from members don't have to be heavily polished, don't have to be heavily edited. So simply, trimming or splicing, adding captions or some branding, identifying who the speakers are. These are really easy things to do, much easier than it was even a few years ago. And there's so many ways to do it. So, we're in the no excuses phase of video, as I like to say. It was like, oh, I don't know how to do that, or we don't have the equipment, or, it was one thing after another thing. All the excuses are gone now. You can do it. You can all do it.
Yeah.
And then, using that content. So on screen, here's an example of one of those examples from ASAE, the idea of publishing the content. If you haven't been on ASAE's LinkedIn page, go to their LinkedIn page and click on video in their posts, and you'll see, here's an organization that a few years ago had almost no video, and now their feeds are flooded with content, like having CAEs talk about why they're CAEs. That's going to attract new people to want to be CAEs, right? So doing it regularly, publishing it in the flow of your other content is really powerful.
Yeah,
and I know we're coming at near time, so I want to just really quickly here, remember strategic objectives. None of these things are for our health, right? It's trying to get people to participate, to be successful with advocacy, or to show up to your events. Think about your goals and how do you reach their goals. All of these tactics should ladder up to the things that you're trying to do as an organization. And measure and optimize. So we don't get enough of this. I think in the association world, the idea of a hypothesis and saying, hey, we don't have to make this a giant project. We can do this one thing, see how it works. No harm, no foul, right? Like, oh, that video wasn't great. That's okay. We're going to learn from that and do another thing. But you really got to take that attitude. The only people who are really successful at digital and communications in particular are the people who are experimenting. And so think like a scientist, I like to say.
Yeah, I love that. So I just wanted to quickly share that our Voice of the Member ebook, our PropFuel's first piece of content ever was the Voice of the Member ebook. And so Robson is going to put that in the chat, a link to that. And just take a look. It's a really great read. I really enjoy reading it, even though I've read it before. It's just such a good reminder of of how to think about engagement and again, incorporating those voices.
Yeah, and we also have a 7 tactics to drive member engagement using video guidebook for association executives, and we can put that in the chat. And then I'm also going to put in the chat a link to a case study about how ASAE is using video, so you can see some of the things that I just mentioned and get a sense of the different ways across the organization that video can be effective. And please feel free to reach out to me if you're interested in gathering voices, if you're just interested in talking about this subject in general. There's my email, and happy to set up a time to continue this conversation.
Yeah, and likewise for PropFuel, I know I glazed over some of the examples of the uses today on email and SMS, but and yes, Christy, I will share the chat as well. But likewise, we'd love to talk more with you and share some more examples that are relevant to your organization and some of your engagement challenges right now. We have a ton of examples across a lot of different industries. So you can go to propfuel.com. I know Robson will put that in the chat as well. If you want to just schedule some time to talk with us, we'd love to connect. And yes, Jeffrey, I will share the member lifecycle graphic as well. I'm glad that was useful. And it's been a pleasure today. I love talking with you, Michael, as always. And we look forward to continuing the conversation with you all.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thanks everybody for taking time out of your day to participate. Great discussion.
Awesome. Thank you. Have a great day.